the morning Walter Haynes called me. I was halfway under a 1987 Ford F-150 that had no business still being on the road, trying to coax a seized brake caliper loose before the first snowfall hit Lunenburg. I'd bought the property 3 years earlier, a collapsed boat-building workshop and 2 acres of waterfront land on Nova Scotia's South Shore that everyone in town said I'd overpaid for. Maybe I had, but I'd grown up watching my grandfather shape wood by hand in a shop not so different from this one. And when I walked through the rotted doorframe and smelled the old sawdust pressed into the floorboards, something settled in my chest that hadn't been settled in a long time. My name is Fletcher. I restore wooden boats. I do it slowly, carefully, the way my grandfather taught me, and I do it in a workshop that took me 2 years of evenings and weekends to make structurally sound. I don't advertise. Work comes by word of mouth, mostly from sailing clubs in Chester and Mahone Bay, occasionally from wealthy summer people who've bought a classic vessel and don't yet understand what they've gotten into. I live simply. I heat with wood. I drive the old truck. I go to bed early and wake up before the harbor lights go out. Walter Haynes was not a word-of-mouth client. I knew the name. Most people in the province did. Haynes Capital, real estate development, 2 commercial towers in Halifax, a resort property on Cape Breton, and a legal dispute with the municipality of Dartmouth that had been running in the Chronicle Herald for the better part of a year. His daughter had been photographed at a charity gala in Toronto the previous spring. I remembered the photo because someone at the marine supply store had left the magazine on the counter, and I'd glanced at it while waiting for a receipt. He wanted to meet. Not a phone consultation. A meeting. He drove down from Halifax that same afternoon in a black Escalade that looked profoundly out of place, parked on my gravel lane. Walter Haynes was a tall man in his early 60s, the kind of man who keeps himself trim and wears it like a credential. He shook my hand with both of his and looked around my workshop with the particular expression wealthy men use when they're deciding whether to be impressed or condescending. He seemed to land somewhere in the middle. He had a 1962 Herreshoff sloop he'd bought at auction in Annapolis the previous summer. It needed serious work. He'd been quoted figures by 3 yards in Halifax and didn't like any of them. Not the numbers, but the attitude. He wanted someone who understood what the boat was, not just what it was worth. We talked for an hour. I showed him a 1949 Acadian dinghy I'd finished in September, the mahogany bright finished, and the seams tight enough that you couldn't slip a business card between them. He ran his hand along the gunwale without being asked to, which told me he actually cared about craft. Before he left, he said there was something else he wanted to discuss. He had a daughter, 26 years old. She'd been working in brand management at a firm in Toronto for 3 years and had recently been let go. Restructuring, he said, though he used the word carefully, like he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. She'd come home to Halifax a month ago and had spent most of that time, in his words, floating. He wanted her to learn something real. He wanted her to understand, and here he paused and picked his phrasing deliberately, that a life built on surfaces eventually cracks. He wanted to know if she could work in my shop for the winter. I looked at him for a long moment. "Doing what? Whatever you need done. I don't need anything done," I said. "I work alone. I know." He reached into his coat and slid a folded check across my workbench. I didn't pick it up. "I'm not asking you to need her. I'm asking you to let her be somewhere real for a while." I should have said no. I'd said no to less reasonable requests for a lot less money, but there was something in the way he said it, somewhere real. That sounded less like a rich man trying to buy a lesson for his daughter, and more like a father who was genuinely frightened for her. I'd seen that particular combination of pride and helplessness before, on my own father's face the winter I quit university and came back to Lunenburg to restore boats with no plan and no guarantee. I left the check on the bench. "She works when I work. 6 in the morning. No exceptions." He nodded. "And I'm not a babysitter." "She doesn't need one," he said. Then quietly, "She just needs to be somewhere the walls are real." Her name was Philippa Haynes. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in November in a Volvo that was hers, not her father's, which I noted. She was wearing good rain gear, the serious kind, not the decorative kind, and she had the expression of someone who had made a decision and was determined not to show any ambivalence about it. She shook my hand and said she preferred Phil. "Okay," I said. "You're early. You said 6. It's 5:45. She looked at her watch, then back at me. I couldn't sleep. I handed her a broom. "Start with the floor." She swept the floor for 40 minutes without being asked to stop or to do anything else, and she did it methodically, working from the back wall forward. getting into the corners with a kind of attention that is either natural or learned from someone who cared about corners. I watched her out of the corner of my eye while I mixed epoxy for a stem repair on the Harrishoff. I didn't say anything, and neither did she. At 6:30, I made coffee in the small kitchen at the back of the shop and poured 2 cups without asking if she wanted one. She took it with both hands and stood at the window looking out at the harbor. "It's beautiful here," she said. "Yes. My father didn't tell me much about what I'd be doing." "Do you need to know in advance?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm used to knowing in advance." "I know," I said. "Most people are. It makes the surprises harder." She turned and looked at me directly, and I had the impression she was deciding something about me in that moment, the same way I'd been deciding something about her. "He told you I was let go," she said. "It wasn't quite a question. He told me you were restructured out of a job. That's the polite version." She set the coffee down. "The actual version is that I spent 3 years building a client portfolio that my manager transferred to himself 6 weeks before they eliminated my position. There's an HR complaint. Nothing will come of it." I didn't say I was sorry because I didn't think she wanted to hear it. "What do you want to learn here?" She looked around the shop, at the long hull of the Harrishoff on its cradle, the ranks of hand planes and chisels, the stacks of ash and cedar along the south wall, the smell of linseed oil and mahogany dust that had settled into everything. "I want to learn something I actually made," she said. "I want to hold something and know it was mine." That was an honest answer. It was the kind of answer that makes work possible. The first 2 weeks were difficult in the way that useful things usually are. Phil learned to use a hand plane on scrap mahogany before I let her near the boat. She struggled with the angle, and she knew she was struggling, which made it worse. She was a person who had been competent at things for a long time, and incompetence sat poorly with her. One afternoon, she spent an hour and a half trying to get a consistent shaving off a piece of quarter-sawn oak and finally set the plane down, not hard, but deliberately, and stood with her back to me for a moment. "Take a break," I said. "I don't need a break." She picked the plane up again. "I didn't say you needed one. I said take one." She put it down again. She went to the door and stood outside in the cold for about 5 minutes. When she came back and her eyes were clear and she asked me to show her the angle again, and this time she got it right on the third pass, and after that she mostly got it right. She asked good questions. That was the thing I noticed first about her. She didn't ask questions to seem engaged. She asked them because she genuinely needed the answers. What makes this joint different from that one? Why this wood here and not that one? Why the grain runs this direction? I answered all of them straight, the same way I'd have answered them for a serious apprentice, and she filed the answers away and used them. She didn't complain about the cold. The shop held heat reasonably well once the wood stove got going, but mornings were brutal until then. And she showed up every morning without comment, in her good rain gear and a wool sweater, and worked until her hands warmed up. About 3 weeks in, I showed her how to fair a hull section with a batten, running the long flexible strip of wood along the frames to find the low spots that the eye can't catch on its own. She picked it up quickly, quicker than I expected, and I said so. "My grandfather was a Finnish carpenter," she said. "I used to watch him. Did he teach you?" He tried. "I thought I had better things to do." She ran the batten along the hull again. I was 17. I thought sitting at a computer was more sophisticated than standing in a shop. She paused. I was wrong about a lot of things when I was 17. Most people say that as a throwaway line. She said it like it still cost her something. December arrived cold and clear, the kind of Nova Scotia cold that comes off the water and gets into your joints. The boat was coming along well. The stem and most of the garboard strakes replaced, the hull faired and ready for caulking. Phil had been doing real work for 2 weeks by then, work that mattered, and she knew it. One evening, I found her in the shop after hours. She didn't know I'd come back for a tool I'd left behind. She was sitting on an overturned bucket by the hull, and she had her hand resting on the planking, just resting there, the way you might rest your hand on a sleeping animal. She wasn't doing anything. She was just there with it. I left without her seeing me. The call from Walter came in the second week of December. He wanted to know how she was doing. I told him she was doing the work. He seemed relieved, and then he said something that changed the temperature of the conversation. He'd accepted an offer on the company, one of the large real estate investment trusts out of Toronto, a deal he'd been working toward for 2 years. He was planning to retire to his place on the Brastor Lakes, and he thought Philippa would be well suited, after the winter, to a role in the new organization's communications division. He had a contact. He could make a call. I said I'd pass that along if she asked. You don't need to wait for her to ask, he said. I think I do, I said. There was a pause. She's not going to stay there, Fletcher. It's a boat shop. I know what it is, I said. I didn't tell Phil about the call right away. I thought about it for 2 days. And the reason I didn't tell her was that I recognized what was happening, and I didn't want to be the person who made it complicated. Something had shifted in the way she moved in the shop. She'd stopped arriving with that braced, determined expression and started arriving the way you arrive somewhere you already belong. She brought lunch in a proper cooler now, instead of grabbing something from the gas station. She'd learned where every tool lived, and she put each one back in its place without being reminded. She was here. Not performing being here, actually here. On a Thursday in mid-December, she split an ash plank along the wrong grain line. It was a good plank, expensive, and the split was not recoverable. She stood there looking at it for a moment, and then said, quietly and carefully, a word I won't repeat. It happens, I said. I know it happens. It happened because I was hurrying. She turned the ruined plank over in her hands. Why was I hurrying? Were you? I had an email from my father this morning about a job in Toronto. I've been thinking about it all day, and I wasn't paying attention to the grain. She set the plank down. I hate that. Which part? She looked at me. The part where my life is somewhere else, and I keep being pulled toward it even when I don't want to go. I could have let it go at that. I almost did. Instead, I said, what do you want? She sat down on the workbench, which she'd started doing a few weeks in. That particular casualness that means someone has stopped being a visitor. She looked around the shop for a long moment. I want to finish the boat, she said. I want to see it go in the water. That's February, maybe March. I know. She looked at me directly. It was the look she'd given me that first morning, the one that meant she was deciding something. Is that a problem? I didn't answer immediately. I'd been trying not to think about the answer to that question, or something adjacent to it, for about 3 weeks by then. No, I said. It's not a problem. That night, she called her father and told him she wasn't interested in the Toronto position. I know because she told me the next morning, not apologetically, not defiantly, just plainly, the way she'd started to tell me most things. He didn't take it well. He'd paid good money, he said. Not in those words exactly, but in the architecture of the conversation. He reminded her of what he'd arranged. She reminded him that she was 26 years old. He said she was being naive. She said she'd been naive when she was in Toronto, taking credit for things that were taken from her. She told me most of this while making coffee in the shop kitchen, speaking matter-of-factly in the thin morning light. Are you okay? I asked. Yes, she said. Then no, but I will be. She handed me a cup. My father's not a bad man. He just genuinely believes that a good life looks like one specific thing, and he's been trying to give it to me my whole life. I know that. I just can't accept the gift. That was the most honest thing I'd heard anyone say about their family in years. January was the coldest month I could remember. The harbor froze along the edges for the first time in over a decade, and Phil and I worked through it with the stove running full and the radio on low, the CBC playing classical music in the afternoons, weather reports in the morning. We caulked the hull seams with cotton and paid them with compound. We built the new coamings from teak I'd been saving for a good job. She got very good with the block plane. She'd rented a room in town by then, above the hardware store on King Street, from a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Collier, who fed her soup on Sundays. She mentioned Mrs. Collier the way you mention people who have quietly inserted themselves into the structure of your days. We had one serious disagreement in late January. I wanted to install a modern, self-tailing winch on the primary sheet position. Phil argued for rebuilding the original bronze winch that had come with the boat. I said it was inefficient. She said efficiency wasn't the point. Tell me what the point is, I said. She crossed her arms. You told me in October that a boat is a record of the choices made by everyone who worked on her. If we put a modern winch there, we're erasing a choice someone made in 1962. I looked at the old winch for a moment. It was corroded but rebuildable. I said, You've been paying attention. I've been paying attention since day one, she said. You were just too busy not noticing to see it. That made me laugh. It surprised me. I don't think I'd laughed in the shop in a very long time. We rebuilt the winch. In early February, her father came to Lunenburg. He didn't announce himself. He simply pulled into the lane one morning while we were fitting the cabin trim, and I looked up and saw the black Escalade through the shop window. Phil saw it too. She set down her chisel and walked to the door and opened it. I stayed where I was. I wasn't trying to listen, but the shop isn't large and sound carries. He said he wasn't there to argue. He said he was there because he'd made a mistake, not in sending her here, but in what he'd expected to happen afterward. He'd thought this would be a reset, a calibration, and then she'd come back to the life he'd been building toward for her. He understood now that it wasn't going to be that. She asked him to come inside and look at the boat. He did. He walked around the hull slowly, the way he'd walked around the finished dinghy the first day he came here, with his hand not quite touching the wood. He looked at the coamings, the rebuilt winch, the new cabin sole she'd sanded and oiled the week before. "Did you do this?" he asked her. "A lot of it," she said. "Fletcher showed me how." He looked at me then. It was the look of a man reassessing something he thought he'd already figured out. I didn't help him with it. He had to do it himself. Before he left, he shook my hand again. "She's good at this," he said quietly. "I know," I said. "She figured that out herself." He nodded, and there was something in his face that might have been relief or grief or both. The expression of a parent who understands that their child has become someone they didn't design. The boat went in the water on the third Saturday of March. We launched her from the town wharf on a morning that was cold and bright. The sky the particular blue that comes after a long winter, the harbor calm enough to see the reflections of the buildings in the water. Phil and I had worked until 2 in the morning the night before doing final checks. Every through-hull fitting, every seacock, the bilge pump, the standing rigging. I didn't ask her to stay. She stayed. When the hull touched the water, when the boat settled and found its waterline and sat the way it was supposed to sit, Phil made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She was standing on the dock beside me, and she put her hand on my arm for a moment, just for a moment, and she said, "We did that." "You did a lot of it," I said. "We did it," she said again. The new owners came later that morning. A couple from Chester, both retired school teachers, who'd been waiting for this boat with a patience that sailors develop because they have no other option. They were overwhelmed in the quiet, dignified way that people are when they receive something they've wanted for a long time. The husband sat in the cockpit for a while without doing anything. The wife ran her hand along the coaming. Phil watched them. I watched her watch them. Her father had offered to fund a proper apprenticeship if she wanted to pursue boat building seriously. She'd told me about it a week earlier in that same matter-of-fact way. Not excited, not dismissive, just presenting the information as a fact and waiting to see what she made of it. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him I'd think about it." She looked up at me. "Is that something you'd want? An apprentice?" I'd been thinking about that question before she asked it, in the way you think about things you're not quite ready to say out loud. I'd been thinking about the shop being quieter after she left, about the radio at the right volume and the morning coffee poured without asking, about a certain unhurried quality that the winter had taken on that I hadn't experienced in the shop before. "I'd want the right one," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "I think I might be the right one." "I think you might be," I said. Neither of us said anything more specific than that for another 2 weeks. We didn't need to. There's a kind of understanding that builds in a shared workspace over a long winter, made of small things. The way someone hands you a tool before you ask for it, the way a silence becomes comfortable rather than empty, the way you stop explaining your reasons for doing things the way you do them, because the other person has already understood. You don't announce that kind of understanding. You just let it be what it is. She moved her things out of Mrs. Collier's room on a gray afternoon in April and into the small apartment above the shop that I'd finished insulating the previous autumn and never found a use for. We didn't make a ceremony of it. She brought boxes. I held the door. The first morning she came downstairs at 5:30 and made coffee before I was even in the shop. I found her standing at the window again, the same window she'd stood at on the first morning, looking out at the harbor. The boat was gone, off on its first sail with its new owners, but the water was still there, and the town, and the particular quality of early light on the South Shore that I've never been able to describe accurately and have stopped trying. "New project?" she asked, without turning around. "Came in yesterday," I said. "A 1955 Cape Islander. Planking's a mess, but the engine is original." She turned and looked at me with an expression I'd been seeing more often lately. Not quite a smile, but something in the vicinity of one, the expression of someone who has found themselves exactly where they intended to end up, though they couldn't have told you in advance that this was where they were going. "Show me," she said.